Do one thing and do it well is a really interesting concept, and a phrase you hear thrown around quite often in the FOSS space, most notably with Linux and BSD and their related software, and it sort of acts as a guiding principle for the way that the software should be designed. But when we say this, what do we actually mean? So let's consider a counterexample, something that probably isn't following this principle. So in China, there are what are known as mega applications or super applications, with WeChat being a fairly common example. So this started as a pretty basic messaging application, like say WhatsApp for example, minus the good encryption, add in some government spying. And over time, it expanded in what it can actually do. Now it supports things like payments, and ride-hailing, and booking flights, Instagram-like image sharing, purchasing mobile credit, there are games in it, and much, much more. All of these disjointed functions don't exist as an application suite where you can download the individual apps like the payment app and the ride-hailing app and all of the other apps. No, they exist as a single application, and these different functions are different subsections of that one application. So we have this app where it doesn't really have a core focus. It is just trying to do basically a bit of everything. So it's pretty easy to say, this app isn't doing one thing. Now, it might be doing it well, I haven't used the application for myself. So if we wanted to redesign this app under the guiding principle of do one thing and do it well, the way we do this is pretty straightforward. Rather than having a single application that does everything you could ever want it to do, instead all of those disjointed functions would then become their own applications. You'd have the payments app, you'd have the booking flights app, you'd have the ride-hailing app. All of those games that exist under it, they would be their own individual applications as well. And there's no harm in having the applications interact with each other. In fact, in cases where this is beneficial, like say having the payment app interact with the flights booking app or the ride-hailing app, this is the whole point of splitting up these functionalities. You don't want to make them less useful, you just want to make it more clear what that individual thing is supposed to be doing. And there's also no harm in naming these things in such a way where it makes it very clear they exist inside of an application suite. Think the way that Google names their things, where you have things like Gmail and Google Docs and Google Drive and Google Calendar. You know, all of these things are part of the Google application suite. But this does open a very interesting can of worms. So do it well is pretty easy to understand. Make good software. Generally, make good software means make software that does what it says it's supposed to do, it's not buggy, it's not gonna crash, things like that. It's pretty easy to understand. Maybe a bit difficult to actually implement, but understanding the concept is pretty straightforward. But what do we mean when we say one thing? So let's consider messaging as an example, and for the sake of my current sanity, let's say that instant messaging is one thing. I'll get more into that in just a bit. But let's say this initial application is pretty much as basic as a messaging application as you can get. You don't have an address book or anything like that. If you want to send someone a message, you connect directly to their IP address, and then you send them their text-based message. So what if we go and start expanding the feature set of this project? What if we add in an address book? Now what if we add in support for images? Maybe you can go and react to those images with emoji, for example. What if we add in bridges to other messaging platforms? How about we now add in support for SMS? All of these things might still be under the banner of instant messaging and add-ons to the instant messaging that don't really break outside of that sphere, but are we still doing one thing? Even though all of these things are directly related to messaging, are these things that actually align with the project? And this is where taking the phrase a bit too literally starts to show a couple of cracks. Let's go over to a Linux example and talk about a project like GIMP. So GIMP offers a lot of image editing functionality. We have things like filters and drawing tools and layering and export types and so many more. And I can define GIMP as doing one thing, and that one thing being editing images. This is a totally valid way to describe it. But you can also break it down into those individual subcomponents. You could even get so pedantic to say that doing anything more than drawing a black straight line is doing more than one thing. Or you could go even further and say that individual functions in the application, those are one thing, and every function needs to be a separate process. And looking back on the super app example, if you want to, you can define this as doing one thing as well. The way we'll define it is not looking at the individual functions it has, instead calling it something like a life management application, which isn't technically wrong because that is exactly what it's doing. Now, you may not see where I was going with that, and think I'm trying to say that this principle is completely useless. That isn't the case. I think the principle is incredibly useful, just not the way that some people go about using it. So, one thing you'll commonly hear when people say they don't like systemd, for example, is systemd is bad because it doesn't follow the Unix philosophy of do one thing and do it well. And that is a perfectly valid way to describe it. But what about things like the Linux kernel? The Linux kernel is a monolithic kernel, where all of these low-level functions like device drivers, file system management, memory allocation, CPU scheduling, and much, much more is handled in this really tight-knit process, as opposed to a microkernel, which things like Windows use, where you still have all of this same functionality, but instead of it all being in one place, it is all handled by separate processes. Now, you can certainly split some things out of the kernel, say not compiling certain sections, or treating some of your device drivers as out-of-tree modules and loading them separately, where, if you're an NVIDIA user, that's what you're used to doing. But when you have a monolithic kernel, it's always going to be doing a lot of things. But the exact same is true about systemd. Just because you're using systemd as your init system doesn't mean you have to use every single other systemd module. A lot of them do heavily rely on each other, but that's not a problem with doing one thing and doing it well, because they're separate binaries. These separate binaries aren't really doing that much. They're just really tightly coupled with each other. That is a whole nother issue, and it might be something you legitimately have an issue with. So, I don't really think that do one thing, do it well has much of a meaning from the user side, but where it does have a lot of value is on the developer side. So using do one thing and do it well as a guiding development principle. So when you start a project, defining a goal and then sticking with it. So the Linux kernel is doing one thing and doing it well because it's trying to be a kernel. It's not trying to be a kernel and also the core utils or a display server or a desktop environment. It is just trying to be the kernel, and it's trying to do it as well as it possibly can. Systemd is also trying to do one thing and do it well. It's trying to be a system manager. It's not trying to be a graphical environment. It's not trying to be a Wayland compositor. It's not trying to be an image editor. It's trying to be something that manages your system. And I think it's doing it relatively well. You might disagree with the well part, but it is trying to meet that goal of being a system manager. GIMP is trying to be an image editor, Kdenlive is trying to be a video editor, so on and so forth. And every project that is being actively developed is going to have scope creep. But by defining this one goal that you want to be focusing on, it allows you to limit that scope creep to a far more manageable level. And in the cases of security relevant software, this can be incredibly valuable because it allows you to limit the attack surface of your software. And the way that I tend to look at it, this principle serves a very similar purpose to another principle known as KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. It's another fairly ambiguous principle, but simple is more of a openly ambiguous term, where it's pretty obvious that simple is up to the interpreter. One thing makes it sound like it's more of a generally definable thing, where it really depends on the way that you're approaching the project. But one thing I do want to make clear is it's not like do one thing and do it well can't be used by the regular end user. Let's say you're considering using OBS or Simple Screen Recorder, and for your personal evaluation, maybe you don't need, different projects or layers and filters and things like that. All you need is a way to capture your screen and maybe even capture your microphone. In which case, OBS is doing way too many things. So by using this guiding principle, it'll point you towards the software that meets the values that you're trying to achieve. But where it isn't useful is when critiquing a piece of software. So if you say that systemd isn't doing one thing and doing it well, if you say OBS isn't doing one thing and doing it well, if you say, a terminal like Xterm, for example, isn't doing one thing and doing it well, all of those are totally accurate, but aren't very useful, because no program is doing one thing. If it was, it wouldn't be a program, it would be a line of code. Now, maybe my audience has changed over the years, but I thought a lot more people consider do one thing and do it well to be incredibly important. So recently I conducted a poll on my audience, and none of you knew it was going to be for a video. So what I found is only 7% of people found it to be crucial to their software choices, with 72% considering it to be an important consideration, 15% literally don't care whatsoever. They're happy to use the super applications if that's going to be a good piece of software. And you know what? None of these people are wrong, because this is entirely based on your opinion. And speaking of your opinion, let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. If you didn't go and vote in the poll, maybe vote in it if you want to, or just leave a comment telling me where you actually stand on do one thing and do it well. I would love to know. So if you like this video, I'm going to go and like the video. If you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, subscribe to Only Verified, link in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.